So I'm gonna change up the layout here because I'll pass out if I don't sit down. Not from alcohol or anything, because they're out of Chardonnay back there. I have a horrible time speaking in public, which if you know me personally, that probably seems weird because I'll never stop talking. Give me a microphone, it's a whole different thing. So thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. I'm really honored to be here. All of these people are incredible. We got to tour the National Ability Center earlier. Was that today? Super awesome, like just an incredible event, and thank you guys for coming out. So I am going to secretly skirt around the whole public speaking thing by just straight up reading y'all something from the book that I'm writing. Thanks. It's gonna be out in 700 years from now, when I can pull it out of my brain. So, is it, oh look, there I am. Okay, great. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about the desert because I love the desert. My husband and I spend a lot of time in the desert. Okay. There is a stretch of desert in southern Utah that is even more nothingy than most. A network of unnamed dirt roads carved aimlessly into fields, dotted with cactus and sagebrush, popping up as if through pores of red dirt. A long, lonesome drive west on Highway 70 winds you past painted clay hills and distant buttes, past the San Rafael Swell Reef, an upthrust of Wingate and Navajo sandstone that juts from the ground like the fins of a dinosaur's back. It is perhaps the only feature around here that might convince you of the fact that this place once loomed deep beneath an ancient sea. Can I have that lemonade? That's not in the book. Thank you. I get like a really dry mouth when I speak, folks. This is awful. Okay, here we go. No, it's fine. I can do this. I need another stool. No, it's fine. Okay. Oh, shit, thank you. Perfect. Just line them up so I can lay down. Yeah. Okay. Twice in relatively recent history, this unassuming stretch of sand has found its way into the limelight. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, as well as other members of their Wild Bunch gang, would hide out here between their famed horseback train heists and daring bank jobs in the late 1800s. Ultimately, it gave this place the name that it still bears today, Robber's Roost. And though the West has long been won, the Roost is still about as wild as it comes these days. 265 square miles of cell-serviceless four-wheel drive roads that end mostly in old mines and towering cliff edges. The only reason one might find themselves out there today is for the unrivaled technical canyoneering opportunities, or if you're a salty old cattle rancher who rolls their eyes every time the van goes by. Beyond the big black bovines lie slot canyons hidden deep within the folds of the earth, accessible only by rope and determination, and sometimes impassable from flash floods and obstacles. That's the kind of adventure a fellow named Aaron Ralston was after. Back in 2003, the next time Robber's Roost made the headlines, by a series of events he can tell you about in his own novel, Ralston found himself stuck in a narrow slot canyon for 5 days without food and water, lodged in place by a boulder that had fallen and crushed his arm. With no options remaining, Ralston managed to extricate a dull 2-inch pocket knife from his backpack and cut his own arm off. What Butch Cassidy and Aaron Ralston both knew was that out here, nobody's coming to find you. My husband Keith and I fell in love with the Roost for the reasons both of those famed men did. It was and still is a hideout of sorts, a place you go when you don't want to be found. One summer evening, under a darkening sky, my husband and the dogs and I set out to the Roost to attempt one of the more challenging slot canyons in the area. In the side view mirror of the van, we watched tall clouds gather in deeply bruised tints of purple. Jagged white lightning tore through the darkness as if the sky had been grabbed from either side and ripped apart. Storms like that are the authors of the desert. Millions of years of them are the reason for the slot canyons that weave through the Roost like veins. Building over the distant mountains, they swoop in and swallow the sky, rewriting the course of canyons and direction of rivers. Torrents of rain uproot junipers and overturn boulders. Winds push mountains of sand out over the roads, effortlessly erasing what men have toiled over. The desert is such a volatile place, in fact, that I've often wondered what it is that I find so peaceful about it. Perhaps it's the silence, perhaps it's the ancientness, or perhaps it's the sheer intention of anything bold enough to grow there, to thrive there. I want it to be in the desert, yes, but perhaps more importantly, I want it to be like the desert, intentional, malleable, tough, resilient. The canyon we climbed down into on this day would put that desire to the ultimate test. This is the only slot canyon I've ever been through that has an actual weight limit. Not very 2019 of this slot canyon, but there's a lot of restrictions. If you weigh more than 180 pounds, or you have a larger chest, women, or that could apply for both men or women, you will not pass through. And there's a lot of people who think that that's like a light warning, and they get doused with dish soap from above and pulled out with ropes from the search and rescue, and that's really how they get you out. I actually met a girl who got pulled out of this canyon. But anyways, in its narrowest sections, the walls range from 24 inches to just 10 inches apart. As you can tell from my big old smush face behind my head, that's a tighter section of this canyon. It's so narrow, in fact, that if I were to try to turn my head to face forward, I'd have scraped the skin off the tip of my nose. The way you make your way through by stemming and sliding your body sideways, pressing your back against one wall, and your knees, forearms, or hands against the other. Resting is achieved by exhaling deeply until your rib cage wedges between the two walls and your feet can dangle. Good times. Every 30 or 40 feet, the crack opens into sandy chambers wide enough for you to stretch your arms out and really not much else. It was as though we were moving through the bowels of a beast, slipping slowly from one cavity into the next. Inside each chamber, we'd reconvene. Our dogs, who are experienced canyoneers in their own right, had joined us on this expedition. Ironically, of all canyons, this one seemed almost designed for them. Smaller, more frequent rainstorms and floodwaters had carved out a little subway-like tunnel at the bottom, and they scurried through it like mice beneath the floorboards. After about 4 hours of moving like that, the final obstacle appeared as we rounded a corner to find the sandstone hallway in front of us tapered to about 6 inches wide. We couldn't fit through, the dogs couldn't fit through. Truthfully, we'd known this was coming. High stemming is a relatively common obstacle in technical canyons. It involves climbing well above the canyon floor by pressing upward with your back, hands, feet, knees, anything else that spans the width of the walls. Oftentimes, you're pressing your way up 30 feet or more until the constriction in the rock widens, and then you shimmy across it. Even the slightest slip can become deadly. I collapsed onto the sand in the small opening before the inevitable upclimb. There was no way to go back. That's the thing about canyoneering. You move through the rock the way that water does, climbing and crawling down and down and down until you're eventually spit out of the crack into probably another crack, maybe a larger crack. Once you commit to the maze of sandstone plumbing, the only way out is through. By some miraculous feat of strength, we would need to attach each dog's harness to our harness and hoist them upward almost 40 feet to traverse sideways through this particular section. I can't help it, I'm so sorry. Keith made the first run through with his backpack dangling from his harness between his legs. Through grunts and gasps, he called back his progress, 40 feet, 50 feet, 60 feet. By the time he reached the next chamber, I could hardly make out what he was saying. He dropped his pack and stemmed all the way back to where I stood, waiting with the dogs. I carefully tightened all 4 of their leg loops on their harnesses as Keith tethered them to us with locking carabiners. Keith would take Dagwood. I would follow closely behind with Bucket, which in retrospect makes no sense because Bucket weighs more than Dagwood, and she's not here for me to be mad at me for telling people that, but she is a lady. Keith dug his knees into one wall and slid his bare back up the other. Dagwood lifted a whole 3 inches off the ground and now hung level but confused between Keith's legs. The veins in Keith's forehead were bulging, sweat seeping from every pore as he slid up inch after agonizing inch. Once he was high enough to begin traversing over, he paused to reach down and adjust Dags, who still hung beneath him like a piñata. So confused. Those dogs are they just are so trusting. I pressed my hands to the wall in front of me and my back to the one behind and pressed upward as hard as I could. Bucket and I didn't move an inch. After several deep breaths, I pressed again, harder this time, and lifted us ever so slightly out of the mud. We held our position for no more than 10 seconds before crashing back down in a mess of paws and feet. I changed my strategy. I dug my bony-ass knee into the wall in front of me and pressed my hands downward behind me, letting out a series of primal screams. I managed to get us up about 20 feet before bursting into tears. Keith shouted words of encouragement, but moments later, my palms, which were soaked with sweat at this point, slipped from the sandstone behind me and sent the back of my skull crashing into the wall. My knees began to slide down the opposite wall, leaving 2 perfect trails of blood directly across from me. Below me was Bucket, and below Bucket was a V-shaped crack that would shatter any bone that fell into it. I screamed Keith's name. I screamed every swear word I could think of, and I can think of a lot. The nearest cell phone service, the nearest paved road, the nearest building was over 3 hours away from the crack I was now wedged inside of in a half upside down fetal position-ish. My crying turned to hyperventilating. My hyperventilating turned to the cold realization that crying and hyperventilating weren't going to get me through this crack in the earth. So I mustered every bit of strength I had, and I safely got myself and my dogs out of that canyon. We burst back into sunlight 6 hours after we climbed in. Bruised and bloodied to a pulp, shirts ripped, backpacks torn, we hobbled back to camp. When I posted this photo, I just put this in my mouth. When I posted this photo on Instagram, along with an abbreviated version, obviously, of that story, someone wrote, "I wonder why you'd ever put yourself through this voluntarily. Has your life been so perfect and lucky that you have to seek out stressful situations?" The internet, y'all. I sat with my phone in my hands, reading and rereading her question. I don't think she meant it maliciously. In fact, I think there's a lot of people out there who question why anyone would take such risk, why anyone would seek out such struggle. There's been plenty of times in my own life where I've been on the 5th pitch of a climb in high winds or neck deep in literal cow shit canyon water or hanging off a 200-foot wall with my dog attached to my harness, and I've wondered, what the am I doing out here? I'm sure many of us have had those moments. The fact is, we don't live in a world that requires us to dig deep anymore, at least not on a regular basis. Things up here are designed for ease and convenience and efficiency, and that's all well and good, but sometimes I think it's made us forget what we're truly capable of. Out here, above ground, I doubt myself constantly, like literally right now. Sometimes I think up shortcuts to get out of feeling uncomfortable or doing things the hard way. I procrastinate because I can. But down in there, you either move forward or you quit. There's no going back, there's no going around, there's no time to wallow, and there's no time to let uncertainty consume you. The only way out is through. If I could have turned around that day, I might have. I might have avoided that fear and that pain at all costs if I had the option, but I didn't. And because I didn't, I tapped into a strength I didn't know that I had. I love the desert because it isn't easy. Everything about that landscape has pushed me to push myself. The walls I claw through out there are nothing compared to the ones in here. When I'm beating myself up about some perceived failure, some insecurity, some deep-seated doubt, I picture myself wedged in that crack in the earth, quite literally crawling, dragging, screaming my way through. It's a trite metaphor perhaps, but it hasn't failed me yet. Those primal triumphs we experience in the outdoors become fibers of who we are as partners, as employees, as friends, as human beings. We take them back with us into this world up here. At the end of the day, it's not about having a perfect life or a lucky life. It's not about never knowing fear or never knowing stress. It's about knowing how deep you can dig when it matters. And that's what I was doing out there that day. And I think that's what so many of us are doing out here every day.